Okay, this is going to be not necessarily a difficult lecture, but maybe you'll find it a disagreeable lecture. It wouldn't be the first disagreeable lecture I've ever given. I want to go back to some of the things that we've done before I talk about civil rights, which won't make you comfortable either. But I confess it's never been my goal as an instructor to make students comfortable. In fact, it's been my goal to make students uncomfortable because facts are uncomfortable. So I want to start by saying when I teach a course like this, I try to distinguish between the facts, what I think are clearly the facts of American government and how to analyze American government, and what my particular views are. Sometimes my views are all over the place. Sometimes what the federal government does, since it's a national government course, I'll just talk about that. Sometimes I agree, sometimes I disagree. But I try as best I can to distinguish between what I know to be accurate in describing American government and what my opinion is. Obviously, like everybody else, I think my opinion is a reasonably framed one, but that doesn't mean they're always right. So this is one of these things where I think the facts are on my side. And I want to go back to what the Constitution means and what fundamental constitutional principles are. And we talked about this earlier, but it runs against the grain of American political culture and conventional opinion. We talked about how the framers designed a constitution that embedded an anti-majoritarian principle. And we need to be clear about what the framers intended. And you can see what they intended, not only based on what they wrote, but also what they did. And again, what they did was to create a governmental system, set of governmental institutions with a different means of selection of the representatives. Okay? When the Constitution was ratified in 1789, the only national governmental body that was subject to popular vote, and keep in mind even then it was only select white males, was the House of Representatives. The Senate was elected by the state legislatures at the time. The Supreme Court members were nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. That remains the same. And the President was early on really elected in the Electoral College rather than by anything remotely like popular vote, which we kind of have today, at least state by state. The framers were very concerned about states not paying their war debts. The framers were very concerned about the Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts, where all of the little people got together and tried to get out from under the debt that was owed to those who were wealthier in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The framers were very clear that they wanted to set up a system where not only majorities couldn't rule, but majorities could hardly ever be formed. And they, for the most part, succeeded. I may not like that. That may disagree, that may be inconsistent with my own view of what a government should be, but that's neither, my view is neither here nor there. The fact of the matter is anti-majoritarianism in government is a fundamental principle of the Constitution of the United States. Yes, it has been modified over time, and we'll talk about that later on. But the framers were not small d Democrats. They didn't believe in democracy, and they didn't believe in majority rule. In fact, they specifically didn't believe in majority rule. So that's fact one. And there's some analysis there. That is not simply my opinion, that is a fact. Now, we may want to change that, but what I need to explain to you is that's what the Constitution meant at the time, and it's a fundamental principle that's really carried on as modified throughout our history. Okay, so now we get to these very troublesome issues of civil liberties. I want to talk about two, one of which I emailed you about. I don't know if you read the article or not, but I'll talk about it, and then we'll move on to civil rights, but you may have some questions. So, in response to some of your discussion board posts, I have a question for you. I have a series of questions for you. Okay, what if I told you that my religion was Muslim? What if I told you that we're going to start every class for the entire year with a prayer of my choosing, a Muslim prayer of my choosing, and we will start the first 5 minutes of every class with me leading a discussion about the virtues of the Muslim religion, or Islam, and why America totally misunderstands Islam, and Islam's a wonderful religion, and you should all become Muslims. And keep in mind, your parents and those people in the communities surrounding your high school pay my salary. And I do this every class, year after year, month after month, to succeeding classes. And so, what I want to know is, what do you think, how do you think you would react to that? And if you told your parents, how do you think they would react to it?
I don't think I like it very much.
Okay, so you wouldn't like it. But would you do anything? Would you just sit there and take it? Or would you... One at a time. You might need to move a little closer so I can hear. Go ahead.
Well, I think the mic just needs to be turned up all the way so he can hear us. Can you hear us better now?
Yes, go ahead.
What?
Raise your hand. I won't be able to see you probably, but raise your hand if you think you would do something about it to try to stop it.
Can you see us now?
Okay. I think I saw most hands up. Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I said, okay, I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Catholic, and actually I'm a priest on this, one of my side jobs, and I'm going to do the same thing only with Catholicism. How many people would say, no, that's not such a cool thing? Again, all the time, every class. Okay, fewer people wouldn't like it, okay? What about if I were Jewish, and I started out with Jewish prayers and how, oh, Jews are misunderstood and we're really wonderful and this is what we believe. And so we're going to say a Jewish prayer every day at the beginning of class and talk a bit about the Talmud and various other religious texts, Jewish religious texts. Would you buy into that every day?
No.
Okay. Well, the bottom line is you shouldn't. You shouldn't. The bottom line is that whether it's what the law of the United States of America is that you cannot do this. The school system cannot do it. School officials cannot do it. If I were to do that, I would be probably fired. Okay? It doesn't mean that it can't happen in private schools, but in public schools where all American citizens have to pay taxes to support the school, and you've got kids of minority or no religious view, or just a religious view that's different from whatever is being laid out by the instructor, that's over the top. That's really not allowed. And if it's a Protestant person who's doing the instruction and doing this, it doesn't matter. That is also unacceptable. First of all, there's a gazillion different Protestant denominations. But secondly, that would be favoring one specific reason. If everybody said, oh, that's fine because we're all Protestant. Well, imagine yourself in a school district or in a school where, the majority are Jewish or the majority is Muslim. You would feel very differently. And so minorities do have rights, and majorities can't under our system, at least under the framers' ideas. The majority can't simply shove anything they want down everybody else's throat. And there are all kinds of protections institutionally laid out in the Constitution to prevent that from happening, even though obviously the Constitution doesn't say a thing about public schools or and hardly public education. So now I get to so it's important to understand that. It doesn't mean that you can't have prayer in school. It needs to be done in specific ways in which, under the law may change. 50 years from now, the law may be different. I suspect it won't be, because we're becoming more religiously diverse, and that suggests that there'll be greater, all other things equal, there'll probably be greater respect for religious diversity, because there'll be more religious diversity. Did you guys see and read the story on the University of Kentucky that I sent you?
I didn't get it.
I didn't receive it either.
Okay, I sent it to your email. So let me tell you.
I check my email every day. I didn't get anything.
Okay, let me tell you the story. Maybe I sent it in voice messages, I'm not sure. After I tell the story, you can, I'm sure, search the internet and find it with ease. Just go to Google News. So, some years ago, the federal Congress passed a law creating Constitution Day in America. And the purpose of the law was to encourage the states and communities and their institutions to have a day where you could learn about the Constitution. So last week was Constitution Day at the University of Kentucky. And I think one of the journalism-related centers at the university organized, an academic center organized an event, and it invited a bunch of people to come and speak about the meaning of the Constitution. And in attendance, of course, were both employees of the University of Kentucky and students of the University of Kentucky, but also some high school students from a journalism class. I don't know the high school involved, but I'm sure it's in the news. And there were a couple teachers there as well from that high school. So one of the invited speakers happened to be a man who is running for campaigning for election to the U.S. Senate in Kentucky as a third-party candidate. I think his name is Ransdell, but I don't even remember his name exactly. So this gentleman gets up to speak. He was an invited speaker. He's a political candidate. And he begins to make a speech in which he rails against and attacks Jews, Jewish control of the media, and how one of his slogans is "With Jews we lose," and he's at this event, invited and a candidate for office, and he's speaking, and the university people cut off his mic and throw him off the stage. And while he's speaking, I'm sure very concerned high school instructors led the high school students out of the auditorium or wherever this event was being held. And so this guy was kicked off the stage, and the students were either removed permanently or temporarily, I'm not sure. One of the bedrock principles regarding civil liberties and the First Amendment is that you cannot, under the law as it currently exists, again, this is not my opinion, this is what the law is. The law is supposed to be content, the laws are supposed to be content neutral. That is, with respect to the First Amendment, it need not, it is of no concern constitutionally what the specific comments or statements of a person are. Okay? So what you have here is a very painful situation of a university holding an event to teach about the Constitution and what it means. And clearly the university doesn't have a clue what it means. And the university ought to be ashamed of itself. The high school teachers are in a bind. They are responsible for the students that they brought with them, and people have the right to, if they don't like something that's being said, they have the right to protest it. They also have the right to leave. What the university doesn't have the right to do is to throw this guy off the stage, especially because he's a political candidate. And the university doesn't have the right to throw him off the stage and shut him up because they don't like the content of what he's saying. Understand, I am not expressing any opinion whatsoever about the substance of what the gentleman said. The gentleman, as far as I'm concerned, is a bigot. He's anti-Semitic. He is a hate monger. But there's a difference between, I mean, think back to the Sullivan case, I believe, in Texas, where the Supreme Court ruled that the guy who was burning the American flag in protest of the Vietnam War was not guilty because the law regarding, as it was applied, the Texas law as it was applied to him, was unconstitutional. So you can't get more rock solid, freedom of speech in a political context than that. So what the Constitution does say with respect to civil liberties is, with regard to freedom of speech, is that guy, as long as that guy is not armed and waving guns for some other kind of mechanism or whatever, bomb or whatever, as long as he doesn't say, let's go out and burn down the synagogue, or let's find some Jews and beat them up or kill them, as long as he doesn't have a mob next to him ready to do harm to people and disrupt public order. None of these things were, in fact, the case in Lexington. As long as he's not threatening the peace, as long as he's just making hateful statements, he has every right to speak under the Constitution of the United States. The students and the teachers, they have a right, especially the high school students and teachers, have a right to leave. They have a right to protest. But the university, as a public body, as a governmental institution, let alone as a university, has absolutely not a leg to stand on in terms of the law of the land. Because again, as I said in an earlier class, the First Amendment doesn't just apply to speech that we agree with. It applies to all speech so long as it is not disruptive or of public order in a meaningful way, as long as it does not threaten violence. If I call you a name, or if I call a group of people a name, that's it's protected speech. Hate speech is protected speech unless it is associated with some kind of action that is otherwise criminal. Now, does this mean the government or that I am endorsing hate speech or bigotry? Absolutely not. This is what the law of the United States is. The difficulty of this case also demonstrates the difficulty of protecting civil liberties. This jerk's freedom of speech, his First Amendment rights, were clearly violated by an agency of the government of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And the Commonwealth was successful in violating his rights. And, he may have recourse, he would have to hire a lawyer, go through the courts, et cetera, but the violation has been done and can't be undone. And that's one of the difficulties of protecting civil liberties. The governments will routinely violate them, and it's not till later that perhaps you're able to get some kind of defense of those civil liberties. So I realize these are controversial comments that I'm making, but these are not simply my opinion. These are what the state of the law is, whether I like it or not, and whether you like it or not. Comments? And some would even say, at least in certain circumstances, we have to listen to people we disagree with. Again, the example of the Westboro Baptist Church picketing soldiers' funerals. I don't want to get on a rant about these people because I think they're totally dreadful. But the courts have upheld their right, given time, manner, and place regulation. Within that context, they're able to speak even though what they say is dreadful. Any comments? Okay, now I'm going to make things even more uncomfortable for you. I want to talk about civil rights. And I want to, in doing so, I want to point out the, for lack of a better term, the kind of schizophrenia we have in American society and American political culture. I don't mean that in a negative way. Let me give you another example of American schizophrenia as reflected in very consistently in polling done of American citizens. So if you ask people, and it's been done many times, do you prefer higher or lower taxes? They're going to say, the majority is going to say lower taxes. And then the next question is, well, do you prefer having more government services, public services provided, or fewer? And they'll say more. Well, my father used to tell me that money doesn't grow on trees. And if you want more services, but you're not willing to pay for them, then where in the heck do you think the money's going to come from? It's not on trees. And so it's not, it's not uncommon. In fact, it's normal for people, this is why the term schizophrenia is a little uncomfortable. It's normal for people to believe contradictory things. It's normal. It's normal in life. It's normal in politics. It doesn't make it easy for us when we believe contradictory things. It means we have to puzzle through and figure out, sometimes on a case-by-case basis, what we what we think. So that, for example, if we say, okay, I want to, let's say somebody wants to spend public dollars, tax dollars, to put a dome over Interstate 64. Well, we may say, we don't need that kind of service. Thank you very much. Just pick up the trash. So all services aren't equal, and but we could then say, okay, well, we don't need a dome. That would be silly. And so then there's no contradiction. But for other types of services, there might be. Well, civil rights is at the heart of the contradictions of our culture and our politics. And of course, it starts with the Constitution's recognition of and legalization of, under certain conditions, slavery. And, in fact, the Constitution's awarding representation to slave states based on 3/5, including 3/5 of each adult male slave, in figuring out their representation in the House of Representatives. So, how is it that we have framers who say all men are created equal, and a Constitution as of 1865 or 6 that says we're going to have equal protection of the laws, yet at the same time we have slavery and the legacy of the ideology of white supremacy and racism embedded in our institutions, social practices and customs, and bigotry that remains in American society. So, this is not meant to be a criticism of the framers, okay? If I were one of the framers in 1790 and I wanted to fly in an airplane, could I do it? Of course not. Airplanes didn't exist. I couldn't fly from Indianapolis to Los Angeles, even if I wanted to. I can't. Planes don't exist. Why do I say this? What I'm trying to say is the framers were men embedded in the society of their time. And the idea that slaves really had equal dignity and equal freedom and equal rights to everybody else, to white people, was not commonly held. In fact, the opposite was commonly held. We would do well to remember that when something is some belief or some set of practices and customs and habits are embedded in people's conduct over time, getting rid of, or somehow overcoming those can be very difficult. So what can we, in thinking about civil rights and the Constitution, what after all can liberty or individual rights possibly mean if we understand that it applies only to white property and adult males, never to women, minorities of color, gay people, those under 21, people with disabilities? So the problem here is not merely that most Americans were excluded from the rights of citizenship. The problem is that along with that comes oppression of those who are excluded and denials of their dignity. In other words, it makes sense to think that if one understands other people as not capable of the rights of citizenship, that somehow that, along with that comes a denial of your human dignity. You're really less than human if you have no rights to exercise. How do we understand that? Your dignity is the same as mine? Your worth is the same as mine? No, I don't think so. On the other hand, we can legitimately claim that American political history has entailed, especially in the last 150 years, a slow, step-by-step process or effort to extend full citizenship and civil rights to previously excluded groups and persons. So the Founding Fathers, and again, this is not a criticism, this is the way it was. This was the reality of the time. Did not intend for the United States to provide equal rights for all, but we're undoubtedly much closer to that today than we were in 1789. So what are civil rights? Civil rights are legal and or moral claims for protection that citizens are entitled to make on the government. Civil rights is largely about government recognition and protection of equal political, social, and economic rights for all Americans. This is not the same as sameness. It's not the same as equal money or equal property ownership, but it is the idea that all citizens have equal political, social, and economic rights. And when we think about civil rights, and this is often not the case, but when we think about civil rights, it's useful to consider that there can be both governmental threats to civil rights as well as non-governmental threats to civil rights. In the news in the past week, and on Facebook, on Facebook and Twitter, one can find information put out by the Wisconsin militia that is organizing to confront voters who they think are they're going to vote Democratic. And the militia is going to be they're saying they're going to be carrying weapons, and they're going to be going into polling places and in front of polling places to try to discourage certain voters that they identify from voting. And this is arguably, it may not be, but it arguably could be a conspiracy to violate civil rights, which is a federal crime, punishable by 10 years. It's certainly an effort to discourage, to try to stop people from exercising their civil rights. Any comments at this point or questions? Okay, here is another difficulty. This is a difficulty that's not resolvable, but it's important that you understand it because it's not often understood or remarked on. Most people will say, well, I'm for civil liberties or I'm for civil rights, what have you, but these two things are not the same. When civil liberties are about the people saying to government, we want government to exercise limited powers, especially when it comes to infringing on or violating the rights of individuals and the privacy of individuals. You can't make me talk if I don't want to. You can't just come into my house without a warrant. You can't tell me what religion I have to practice. You can't deny my peaceful freedom of speech as the University of Kentucky did to that guy last week, and so on. So civil liberties is about the claim that government should be limited in the sense that it not violate individual rights. So it's don't do this, don't do that. Okay, government, keep in your place. Civil rights is just the opposite. With civil rights, we're saying we demand that government guarantee equality before the law. We demand that government protect equal citizenship, even when large segments of the society oppose this equality. So in civil liberties, we're saying, chill, don't act, stay out of our business. On the other hand, in civil rights, we're saying we want an activist government to guarantee equal citizenship and equality before the law. These, I'm not saying you can't have both of these. What I'm saying is these two concepts embody very different ideas about how active we would like government to be. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it's good or bad or in between. I'm simply saying civil liberties says limited government with respect to, don't violate our rights. Civil rights says government act to promote and guarantee equality before the law and equal citizenship. So, the 14th Amendment is key to government protecting civil rights. Section 1 is in the bottom half of this slide. All persons born or naturalized and subject to the U.S. jurisdiction are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge privileges or immunities of citizens of the U.S., nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So this is the basis for the claim to civil rights, which demand that governments affirmatively recognize and enforce equal rights, even when governments and various social institutions and groups wish to or act to deny those equal rights. People have civil rights largely when government uses its constitutional powers to protect those civil rights. So, just like the framers, you and I are to some degree prisoners of, and I mean prisoners in quotes in the nicest possible way, of the time in which we live, the time in which we're brought up. And what American history tells me, and this is a little more opinion than fact, but I think a good bit of fact as well, is in the absence of federal laws, policies, and actions, and in the absence of social movements for change, and in the absence of a civil war, which of course we had, state and local government laws and traditional community practices and beliefs would likely have continued to deny the civil rights of most Americans, and certainly black Americans, and to exclude them from our political, social, and economic life. To cut to the chase, what I'm saying is there is strong evidence in our history that if the federal government did not act in a consistent manner, does not act in a consistent manner, to enforce the meaning of the 14th Amendment, state and local governments probably as often as not won't. And in fact, they're still at that, I would argue. So where does this come from in our history, in our political history? Well, one of the most famous, or if you prefer, infamous Supreme Court decisions was Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857. And the Dred Scott ruling held that African Americans, whether they're slave or free, could not be American citizens, and therefore, among other things, had no standing to sue in federal court. Further, the Dred Scott decision held that the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in the federal territories acquired after the creation of the United States in 1791. And one of the consequences of this decision was that it increased tensions between North and South and was a prelude, really, to the Civil War. So this is a map of the U.S., and you can see in yellow the acquired territories, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the Mexican Cession in 1848, the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. And so Dred Scott basically said that the federal government could not regulate slavery in any place west of the Mississippi or Florida. And so there was a struggle to abolish slavery, and it began probably in the 1830s, and one of the leaders was a man named William Lloyd Garrison. And I actually found out just on a fluke that one man who married my I don't know, my great-grandfather's niece was involved with some of the abolitionists, those who were trying to abolish slavery. So in 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and in subsequent years, still in the 1860s, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, the 13th prohibiting slavery, 14th granting full citizenship to blacks, and the 15th giving black men the legal right to vote. Keep in mind, at this time, this is now roughly 150 years ago, women still have no right to vote. So after the Civil War, the Congress passed some Civil Rights Acts in the next decade that were aimed at the southern states, trying to prevent them from passing laws to circumvent these Civil War amendments. However, much of the country, especially most of the southern states, were able to resist these federal efforts. And we'll talk about some of the specifics right now, and that'll probably be the end of this will probably be the last slide. So why were the early civil rights laws ineffective? Well, in 1896, another famous Supreme Court decision was Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court decision that remained the law of the land until 1954. In other words, it remained the law of the land for nearly 60 years, which is, was at the time fairly close to people's life expectancy. Plessy held that states that had segregation statutes, those statutes were constitutional as long as the states followed a separate but equal doctrine. That doctrine meaning, okay, we can have blacks here and whites here in separate institutions as long as they are equal in terms of the services, the government services and benefits they provide. So public facilities, public accommodations, services, things like stores and restaurants, hotels, buses, trains, all of these, everything in life could be separate. Bathrooms, schools, white, black. Furthermore, at this time, the southern states began to pass what are called by historians Jim Crow laws. And these laws were systematically designed to deny the equality of blacks. And these state laws were basically upheld by the courts until after World War II. And we'll talk about why after World War II later, tomorrow. So one example of Jim Crow laws were voting barriers. And the purpose of the voting barriers was to deny black people and some poor white people the right to vote so they could not challenge segregation and could not challenge the white oppression of blacks. So one example of a Jim Crow law was the grandfather clause. Grandfather clause law said that if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't vote. Well, grandfathers were slaves. They had no voting rights. So if your grandfather was not a voter, then you couldn't vote. Another was the white primary, and this was upheld initially by the courts. The white primary said decision, and the laws were white primary laws were upheld. The white primary decision basically said, hey, look, political parties are not governmental entities; they're private organizations. Therefore, they have the right to exclude black people from primary election voting. And that was the intent of the white primary. Literacy tests. You can actually find copies of Southern state literacy tests that were still in effect when I was in high school. And if you failed the literacy test, then you weren't allowed to vote. The Board of Elections wouldn't let you vote. And what the literacy test often was questions about the state constitution and what it meant. And more than likely, the folks who were administering the test didn't know the answers to the questions either. Another example was the poll tax. The poll tax was a tax that was created by Southern state laws. If you didn't pay a poll tax, then you couldn't vote. Well, a disproportionate number of poor people and were African American, and there are a lot of white people who were poor as well. They would be under poll tax legislation, and the southern states denied the right to vote, and they were. And eventually, in the early 1960s, there was a constitutional amendment that prohibited poll taxes. I would argue poll taxes have now come back under a different guise. We'll talk about that perhaps another time. Well, I don't know if you can see this this last slide here. Let me see what I can do about this. Probably not very much. We're out of time anyway, so I'll pick up at the very bottom of this slide for next time. Or I know we're 2 minutes over. Do you have any comments or questions at this point?
No.
Okay, see you tomorrow.